v.org.
Next on Book TV, Tom Engelhardt, creator and editor of TomDispatch.com, argues that the U.S. government successfully used the threat of terrorism to scare the public into supporting increased spending on war, the military, and homeland security. This is about an hour, 40 minutes.
Well, welcome, everyone. Before I introduce Tom Engelhardt, I just wanted to say that I am a very proud supporter of Haymarket Books. You know, there's that old saying that the press is only free if you own one. And when Haymarket was created, it really was like the people had a press to do stories, to tell stories, and to produce books that had a social justice focus, that were not interested in a trickle-down telling of history, but a rising-up telling of history. And I think it's very fitting that someone like Tom Engelhardt would be publishing with Haymarket Books, because it really is a match made in rebellion. You know, for years, I actually thought Tom Engelhardt's name was Tom Dispatch, because I subscribed to this wonderful newsletter that was covering the issues of the day, but covering them in a way that was totally anathema to the way that corporate media functions in the society. Getting in depth, tapping experts, highlighting whistleblowers, analyzing U.S. policy without regard to partisan considerations. And I think that Tom Dispatch is some of the best we have to offer in this country in terms of citizen journalism, and journalism that challenges not only a corporatocracy or a sort of duopoly, but also challenges corporate media outlets on their own turf. And I think if you haven't heard of Tom Dispatch or have signed up for that newsletter, you most certainly should. But of course, his name is not Tom Dispatch. His name is Tom Engelhardt. And the book that we're here to celebrate tonight is The United States of Fear. I had the honor of helping Tom launch his last book, The American Way of War. And I generally don't like it when authors read from their books. I would rather just hear them talk. I was so just taken with the passion of Tom Engelhardt when he was reading from his last book. I'm very excited to hear him read a couple of excerpts from his current book. Beyond being a great writer, Tom is an incredible editor. And he's edited books that probably many of you in this room have read through the American Empire series at Metropolitan Books. He's edited Noam Chomsky, Chalmers Johnson, Andrew Bacevich, some of the leading dissident minds in the United States. If we lived in a more sane reality, the mind of Tom Engelhardt would be tapped by the national security apparatus to actually help analyze what U.S. policy should be around the world. And let's be clear about this. We live in a very dark moment in history where the United States is simultaneously waging covert wars, overt wars, air wars, drone wars, economic wars on multiple continents and in scores of countries around the world. The U.S. announced, and there was much fanfare about the end of the Iraq War, and yet we see Iraq descending further and further into chaos, and the United States has this massive embassy there and is actually increasing the number of private contractors that are going to be operating in Iraq as the official U.S. military withdraws. In Afghanistan, the United States is increasingly moving toward a front and centering of the most lethal forces in the U.S. arsenal, those from the Special Operations Command, the Joint Special Operations Command. All of America heard about the Joint Special Operations Command and SEAL Team 6 because of the targeted assassination of Osama bin Laden. But actually, the Joint Special Operations Command has been around for a long time and has been at the heart of some of the most lethal operations that the U.S. has carried out in declared battlefields and in undeclared battlefields. And we're going to be hearing a lot more from them in Afghanistan because they're the lead force in doing the night raids. And that is the premier policy right now around the world, is believing that there are a finite number of bad guys that simply need to be killed, and this problem is going to be solved. I just returned from a 2-week reporting trip in Yemen, where the United States has been increasing its bombing in that country, not just through drones, but also through Tomahawk cruise missiles and cluster bombs. And I assure you that the civilians that are being killed in these bombings are fueling a rage that will be very, very difficult to stamp out later down the line. In Somalia, where I was a few months ago, the United States is backing ruthless warlords, including some of them who were key al-Qaeda allies at another point in their life, and those that helped to destroy Somalia in the first place in the early 1990s. The United States continues to be involved with secret prisons, including in Somalia, in Mogadishu. In Pakistan, U.S. raids into Pakistan continue. Relations are deteriorating between the U.S. and Pakistan because of these raids. And terrorism, or the perceived threat of terrorism, seems to be expanding in countries where the U.S. claims to be trying to stamp it out. Those two realities cannot be seen as separate from each other. We have to come to grips with the possibility, I would say the reality, that U.S. policy is actually fueling terrorism, but also giving people a justifiable reason to be angry at the United States. And in all of the countries I've been traveling to in the past 2 years, I've seen that in a very, very clear way. And one of the sources that I go to for serious analysis, for people who are going to think outside of the box of conventional Washington thinking. Well, I sound like Mitt Romney. But outside of the box of convention, I am definitely not a Washington insider. One of the places that I go regularly to read serious analysis and to be provoked in a very good way is Tom Dispatch and the work of Tom Engelhardt. And so please join me in giving a hearty welcome to the author of The United States of Fear, Tom Engelhardt.
Well, Jeremy's kind of a stand-up guy, and I'm kind of a stand-down guy. I'm an editor, and it's rare in my life that I'm in front of any group of people like this, so I'm a little relieved that I have something to read before we get to spontaneity. I'm assuming, since I'm here in the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, that some of you are actually young journalists or journalists-to-be. And of course, I'm about to have a conversation with an investigative journalist who gets out there on the ground in the hairiest of places and regularly comes back with the goods. I'm impressed. I'm always impressed with great reporters. I've been a news jockey since I was a kid, and while I spend time endlessly online, I still read my hometown paper daily or nightly in print. I love the generosity of journalists, by which I mean their willingness to go places I wouldn't or couldn't go, and bring back experiences and worlds I would otherwise have no way of entering. And when I speak about reportorial generosity, for the best of journalists anyway, I'm also referring to their skill in entering the world I live in every day and wresting from it stories I hadn't even imagined were there. In my life, I've known journalists as a book editor, and now as the guy who does the website tomdispatch.com. I've published their work, and for years I taught journalism graduate students every spring at the University of California, Berkeley. For a few years in my life, long ago, I even worked at a small West Coast news service. But just to be clear, these days, when someone refers to me as a journalist, I always deny it. If pressed as to what I consider myself to be, I usually say that professionally speaking, I'm a guy in a room, which is, of course, a literal description of the essence of my life. And by the way, I don't mean it as a put-down. I say it with some pride. I mean, if you think about it, Jon Stewart is also just a guy in a room. Admittedly, he's got one heck of a room, and he's an awful lot funnier than I am, but still. The fact is, in our world, which is often remarkably stifling when it comes to thinking about writing, about our politics, about the national security state, about what used to be called foreign policy, but is now more accurately thought of as global military policy, we definitely need some guys in rooms, even when, as with me, the rooms are very, very small. We need people willing to try to step back, ready to try to make their way out of the mass of trees and actually take in the woods we're largely lost in. My book, The United States of Fear, is really what one guy in such a room could produce in a year of reading, writing, talking, and doing my best to consider our American world and the absurdities in it that are accepted as ordinary reality. As those of you who read Tom Dispatch know, I write long myself, and I like to run long framework-style pieces at the site, by others, that is, despite what everyone thinks about brevity, attention spans, and the internet. Before Jeremy and I talk, I'm going to read you two pieces from the book, both, however, on the shorter side. The first, as you'll see, is really my thoughts about guys and rooms. I wrote it back in March 2010, well before our military was out of Iraq, and just after the Supreme Court issued its Citizens United decision, but before it was utterly clear that the floodgates had been opened so wide that what might be called the politics of the rich in America would soon become simply American politics. I called it, On Being a Critic, All the World's a Stage for Us. In March 2010, I wrote about a group of pundits and warrior journalists eager not to see the U.S. military leave Iraq. That piece appeared on the op-ed page of the Los Angeles Times and in a longer version at tomdispatch.com, and then began wandering the media world. One of its stops, curiously enough, was the military newspaper Stars and Stripes. From a military man came this emailed response: "Read your article in Stars and Stripes. When was the last time you visited Iraq?" A critique in 15 well-chosen words, so much more effective than the usual long, angry emails I get. And his point was interesting. At least it interested me. After all, as I wrote back, I was then a 65-year-old guy who had never been anywhere near Iraq and undoubtedly never would be. I have to assume that my emailer had spent time there, possibly more than once, and disagreed with my assessments. First-hand experience is not to be taken lightly. What, after all, do I know about Iraq? Only the reporting I've been able to read from thousands of miles away or analysis found on the blogs of experts like Juan Cole. On the other hand, even from thousands of miles away, I was one of many who could see enough by early 2003 to go into the streets and demonstrate against an onrushing disaster of an invasion that a lot of people, theoretically far more knowledgeable on Iraq than any of us, considered just the cat's meow, the cakewalk of the new century. It's true that I've never strolled down a street in Baghdad or Ramadi or Basra, armed or not, and that's a deficit if you want to write about the American experience in Iraq. It's also true that I haven't spent hours sipping tea with Iraqi tribal leaders or been inside the Green Zone or set foot on even one of the vast American bases that the Pentagon's private contractors built in that country. Nor did that stop me from writing regularly about what I called and still call America's ziggurats, when most of the people who visited those bases didn't consider places with 20-mile perimeters, multiple bus lines, PXs, familiar fast food franchises, Ugandan mercenary guards, and who knows what else to be particularly noteworthy structures on the Iraqi landscape, and so, with rare exceptions, worth commenting on. I'm certainly no expert on Shiites and Sunnis. I'm probably a little foggy on my Iraqi geography, and I've never seen the Tigris or Euphrates rivers. On the other hand, it does occur to me that a whole raft of American pundits, government officials, and military types who have done all of the above, who have spent time up close and personal in Iraq, or at least in the American version of the same, couldn't have arrived at dumber conclusions over these last many years. So first-hand experience, valuable as it may be for great reporters like, say, Anthony Shadid of the Washington Post and now the New York Times, or Patrick Coburn of the British Independent, can't be the be-all and the end-all either. Sometimes being far away, not just from Iraq, but from Washington and all the cloistered thinking that goes on there, from the visibly claustrophobic world of American global policymaking, has its advantages. Sometimes being out of it, experientially speaking, allows you to open your eyes and take in the larger shape of things, which is often the obvious, even if little noted. I can't help thinking about a friend of mine whose up-close and personal take on U.S. military commanders in Afghanistan was that they were trapped in an American-made box, incapable of seeing beyond its boundaries, that is, seeing Afghanistan. I have no doubt that being there is generally something to be desired. But if you take your personal blinders with you, it often hardly matters where you are. Thinking about my Stars and Stripes reader's question, the conclusion I've provisionally come to is this. It's not just where you go, it's also how you see what's there, and no less important, who you see, that matters, which means that sometimes you can actually see more by going nowhere at all. An Iraqi tragedy. When American officials, civilian or military, open their eyes and check out the local landscape, no matter where they've landed, all evidence indicates that the first thing they tend to see is themselves. That is, they see the world as an American stage, and those native actors in countries we've invaded and occupied, or where, as in Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, we conduct what might be called semi-war, as so many bit players in an American drama. This is why, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, military commanders and top officials like Secretary of Defense Robert Gates or National Security Advisor James Jones continued to call so utterly unselfconsciously for putting an Iraqi or Afghan face on whichever war was being discussed. That is, to follow the image to its logical conclusion, putting an Iraqi or Afghan mask over a face that they recognize, however inconveniently or embarrassingly, as American. This is why American officials regularly say that Afghans are in the lead when they aren't. This is why when you read newspaper descriptions of how the United States is giving Afghan President Hamid Karzai the leading role in deciding about the latest military offensive or pushing such and such an official with his U.S. or Western mentors in the wings to take the lead in some action that seems to have been largely planned by Americans, the Afghans sound like so many puppets, which doesn't actually mean that they are. And this doesn't embarrass Americans in the least. Generally speaking, the American post-9/11 language of power, ostensibly aimed at building up the forces Washington supports in Muslim lands, invariably sounds condescending. They are always peripheral to us, even when they are being urged or prodded to be at the center of the action. This is why their civilians who come in harm's way are referred to as collateral damage, an inconceivable way to describe American civilians in harm's way. This is why, from the Vietnam era to today, in the movies that are made about our wars, even the anti-war ones, Americans invariably hog center stage. Well, you usually have to keep a careful watch to find passing evidence of those we are fighting against or for. This was why 40 years ago, the Vietnam War was regularly referred to here, whether by hawks or doves, as an American tragedy, not a Vietnamese one, and why the same thinking applies to Afghanistan and Iraq today. This is why, using imagery that might have come out of the mouths of 19th century colonialists, American officials long talked patronizingly about teaching the Iraqi child to pedal the bike of democracy, with us as global parents holding on to the bike seat. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, did this very vividly. It just stays in my mind. This is the context within which even a president, and this was President Bush, wondered when to take off the training wheels. This is evidently why today the introduction of democracy to Iraq is considered an American gift so precious that it somehow makes up for anything that's happened in the past 8 years. This is why, for instance, pundit Tom Friedman could write this sentence about the U.S. project in Iraq. Former President George W. Bush's gut instinct that this region craved and needed democracy was always right. Like Afghanistan before it, Iraq is now largely the forgotten war, and here, that is. And here's a little of what's been forgotten in the process of what Friedman suggests he'd prefer to leave future historians to sort out. That the American invasion led to possibly hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths. That literally millions of Iraqis had to flee into exile abroad and millions more were turned into refugees in their own country. That the capital, Baghdad, was significantly ethnically cleansed in a brutal Shiite-Sunni civil conflict. That the country was littered with new killing fields. That a devastating insurgency roiled the land and still brings enough death and terror to Baghdad to make it one of the more dangerous places on the planet. That a soaring unemployment rate and the lack of delivery of the most basic services, including reliable electricity and potable water, created nightmarish conditions for a vast class of impoverished Iraqis. That the U.S. government, for all its nation-building boasts, proved remarkably incapable of reconstructing the country or its oil industry, even though American private contractors profited enormously from work on both. That a full-scale foreign military occupation left Americans on 500 bases nationwide and in the largest embassy on the planet. The pride of us. In other words, as bad as Saddam Hussein was, and he was a megalomaniacal monster, what followed him was a staggering catastrophe for Iraq, even if Americans no longer care to give it much thought. Against the charnel house that Friedman would prefer to leave to history, however, stands one counterbalancing factor, the gift of democracy. Even many who never supported George W. Bush's democracy agenda now seem to take some pride in this. Let's leave aside for a moment the The fact that the Bush administration arrived in Iraq with remarkably undemocratic plans for the country and was thwarted only by the unwavering insistence of the revered Shiite cleric Ali Sistani on a one-person, one-vote election. In all of this, there are staggering levels of hypocrisy. In the fact that we were for Saddam before we were against him, in the fact as well that the U.S. government has, in instance after instance, regularly fostered and supported military juntas, strongmen, and dictators while holding off or overthrowing democracies not to our taste or not in what Washington defined as our interests. Perhaps stranger yet, the democracy that we actually have in the United States, and so can offer as our ultimate apology for invading and occupying other countries, is rarely subjected to analysis in the context of the glorious urge to export the same. So let's stop for a moment and think a little about the American urge to be thrilled that, despite every disaster, against all odds, our grand accomplishment lies in bringing American democracy to Iraq. The rectification of names. Democracy, like terrorism, is a method, a means to an end, not an end in itself. Nobody is ruled by elections any more than any organization is run by terror or has terror as its ultimate goal. If this obvious point had been accepted in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the absurdity of the idea of a global war on terror would have been self-evident, as would a global war to deliver democracy to faraway peoples. Democracy, after all, is a way to determine and then express the majoritarian will of a people, a way to deliver power to the people, or, more important, for those people to take possession of it themselves. It's the sort of thing that, by its nature, is hard to import from great distances, especially when, as in our case, the delivery system to be exported seems strikingly deficient. And keep in mind that the people exporting that system to Iraq were largely incapable of seeing the Iraqis as actors in their own democratic drama. They were incapable, that is, of imagining the nature of the lives they wanted to shape and change. In a sense, that was hardly less true when they looked homeward. After all, the glorious democracy they trumpeted to the world bore little relation to the Pax Republicana, headed by an imperial presidency complete with a cult of executive power that they dreamed of installing in Washington for generations to come. Given the nature of American democracy today, the first billion-dollar presidential election, the staggering levels of lobbying and influence peddling that go with it, the stunning barrages of bizarre advertising, the increasingly corporate-owned and financed campaigns, a half-broken congressional system, a national security state with unparalleled powers and money, and so on, why all the effort to take it to Iraq? Why measure Iraqis against it and find them lacking? After all, in 2000, our presidential election went to the non-majoritarian candidate thanks to decisions made by Supreme Court justices appointed by his father. If this had happened in Nigeria, Afghanistan, or perhaps Iraq, we would know just what we were dealing with. The fact is, we have no word to adequately describe what at the national level we still persist in calling democracy, what we regularly ask others to admire to the skies or bow down before. In imperial China, when a new dynasty arrived on the scene, the emperor performed a ritual called the rectification of names, in the belief that the previous dynasty had fallen in part because reality and the names we have for it, the names they had for it, had ceased to correspond. We in the United States undoubtedly now need such a ceremony. We certainly need a new term for our own democracy before we're so quick to hold it up as the paragon for others to match. We also need to rethink our language when it comes to the U.S. military undertaking nation building in distant lands, as if countries could be constructed to our taste in just the way that KBR or DynCorp construct military bases in them. So no, I have never been to Iraq. But yes, I've been here for years watching, and I can see, among other things, that the American mirror on the wall, which shows us ourselves in such beautiful Disney-esque detail, has a few cracks in it. It looks fragile. I'd think twice about sending it abroad too often. Now, for my second reading tonight, I chose a personal piece about a subject that's been in the news repeatedly in recent years, but only in the strangest and most limited of ways. One of the bizarre spectacles of our American moment has been this: nuclear weapons and nuclear politics only manifest themselves in one fashion in our news and what passes for popular discussion, punditry, and political debate. I'm talking, of course, about the Iranian bomb, the one that we can't stop yakking about, writing about, beating the war drums over, warning about, or fretting over almost daily, the one that doesn't exist. It's the nuclear weapon that isn't. There is no evidence that the Iranians are moving to build nuclear weapons at the moment. At worst, our intelligence services suggest that they are moving toward what's called breakout capacity, the ability to build a weapon relatively quickly if a decision to do so were made. Nonetheless, this is the only nuclear weapon in the world, other than in brief moments, the perfectly real North Korean ones, that get any significant attention. The United States, at last count, possesses 5,113 nuclear warheads. Russia, similar thousands. About ourselves, as about the Russians or the Israelis, who probably have a couple of hundred in their undeclared but all too real arsenal, we evidently have no doubts or worries. We certainly trust ourselves implicitly, though we are, of course, the only country ever to use such weapons. The recent Pentagon budget cuts, and you'd have to put that word cuts in quotes, as of now involve no cuts to our nuclear arsenal. The actual monies going into it are, in fact, on the rise. And about it, no one demands anything. No one panics. No one thinks about going to war. Nor do we fret about, say, the Indian nuclear arsenal, whose further development Washington has aided and abetted, even though the South Asian subcontinent is probably the place on the planet where nuclear weapons are most likely to be used. In any case, with all that in mind, and given the fact that from childhood I've had what we used to call the bomb, and we'd put it in caps, on the brain, I thought I would read this piece tonight, which I wrote as another August Hiroshima anniversary rolled around. It's called The Nuclear Story That Refuses to Go Away. Even though we promptly dubbed the site of the 9/11 attacks in New York Ground Zero, once a term reserved for an atomic blast, Americans have never really come to grips either with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki or with the nuclear age that they ushered in. There can be no question that, as the Big Bang that might end it all, the atomic bomb haunted Cold War America. In those years, while the young, myself included, watched endless versions of nuclear disaster transmuted into B-horror films, the grown-ups who ran our world went on a vast shopping spree for world-ending weaponry, building nuclear arsenals that came to number in the tens of thousands. When the Cold War finally ended, with the Soviet Union's quite peaceful collapse, however, a nuclear peace dividend never quite arrived. The arsenals of the former superpower adversaries remain quietly in place, drawn down but strangely untouched, awaiting a new mission, while just beyond sight the knowledge of the making of such weapons spread to other countries ready to launch their own threatening mini-Cold Wars. Even 50 years after that first bomb went off over Hiroshima, it still proved impossible in the United States to agree upon a nuclear creation tale. Was August 6, 1945 the heroic ending to a global war or the horrific beginning of a new age? The Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the Hiroshima bomb and a shattered school child's lunchbox from Hiroshima, could not yet, it turned out, inhabit the same exhibit space at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Still, for people of a certain age, like me, Hiroshima is where it all began. So I would like to try once again to lay out the pieces of a nuclear story that none of us, it seems, can yet quite tell. In my story, there are three characters and no dialogue. There is my father, who volunteered at age 35 for the Army Air Corps immediately after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He fought in Burma, was painfully silent on his wartime experiences, and died on Pearl Harbor Day in 1983. Then there's me, growing up in a world in which my father's war was glorified everywhere, in which my play fantasies in any park included mowing down Japanese soldiers, but whose nightmares were of nuclear destruction. Finally, there's a Japanese boy whose name and fate are unknown to me. This is a story of multiple silences. The first of those, the silence of my father, was once no barrier to the stories I told myself. If anything, his silence enhanced them, since in the 1950s, male silence seemed a heroic attribute. And perhaps it was, though hardly in the way I imagined at the time. Sitting in the dark with him then, at any World War II movie, was enough for me. As it turned out, though, the only part of his war I possessed was its final act. And around this, too, there grew a puzzling silence. The very idea of nuclear destruction seemed not to touch him. Like other school children, I went through nuclear attack drills with sirens howling outside, while, I had no doubt, he continued to work unfazed in his office. It was I who watched the irradiated ants and nuclearized monsters of our teen screen life stomp the earth. It was I who went to the French film Hiroshima Mon Amour, where I was shocked by my first sight of the human casualties of the A-bombing, and to On the Beach to catch a glimpse of how the world might actually end. It was I who saw the mushroom cloud rise in my dreams, felt its heat sear my arm before I awoke. Of all this, I said not a word to him, nor he to me. On his erstwhile enemies, however, my father was not silent. He hated the Japanese with a war-bred passion. They had, he told me, done things that could not be discussed to boys he had known. Subsequent history, the amicable American occupation of Japan or the emergence of that defeated land as an ally, did not seem to touch him. His hatred of all things Japanese was not a ruling passion of my childhood, but only because Japan was so absent from our lives. There was nothing Japanese in our house. One did not buy their products. We avoided the only Japanese restaurant in our part of town, and no Japanese ever came to visit. In the end, I followed my own path to Hiroshima, drawn perhaps to the world my father had so vehemently rejected. In 1979, as an editor, I published Unforgettable Fire, the drawings of Hiroshima residents who had lived through that day, the first time any sizable number of images of the human damage there made it into mainstream American culture. I visited Japan in 1982 thanks to the book's Japanese editor who took me to Hiroshima, an experience I found myself unable to talk about on return. This too became part of the silences my father and I shared. To make a story thus far would seem relatively simple. Two generations face each other across the chasm of a war and an act that divided them. It is the story we all know. And yet, there is my third character and third silence, the Japanese boy who drifted back into my consciousness after an absence of 4 decades only a few years ago. I no longer remember how he and I were put in contact sometime in the mid-1950s. Like me, my Japanese pen pal must have been 11 or 12 years old. If we exchanged photos, I have no memory of his face, nor does a name come to mind. If I can remember half-jokingly writing my own address at that age, New York City, New York, USA, planet Earth, solar system, galaxy, the universe, I can't remember writing his. I already knew by then that a place called Albany was the capital of New York State, but New York City still seemed to me the center of the world, and in many ways, I wasn't wrong. Even if he lived in Tokyo, my Japanese pen pal could have had no such illusions. Like me, he had undoubtedly been born during World War II. Perhaps in his first year of life, he had been evacuated from one of Japan's charred cities. For him, that disastrous war would not have been a memory. If he had gone to the movies with his father in the 1950s, he might have seen Godzilla, not the U.S. Air Force dismantle Tokyo, and he might have hardly remembered those economically difficult first years of American occupation. But he could not at that time have imagined himself at the center of the universe. I have a faint memory of the feel of his letters, a crinkly thinness undoubtedly meant to save infinitesimal amounts of weight and so money. We wrote, of course, in English, for much of the planet, if not the solar system, galaxy, universe, was beginning to operate in that universal language that seemed to radiate from my home city to the world like the rays of the sun. But what I most remember are the exotic-looking stamps that arrived on or in his letters, for I was, with my father, an avid stamp collector. On Sunday afternoons, my father and I prepared and mounted our stamps, consulted our Scott's catalog, and pasted them in. In this way, the Japanese section of our album was filled with that boy's offerings, without comment, but also without protest from my father. We exchanged letters, none of which remain, for a year or two, and then, who knows, what interest of mine or his overcame us, perhaps only the resistance boys can have to writing letters. In any case, he too entered a realm of silence. Only now, remembering those quiet moments of closeness when my father and I worked on our albums, do I note that he existed briefly and without discussion in our lives. He existed for both of us, perhaps, in the ambiguous space that silence can create. And now I wonder sometimes what kinds of nuclear dreams my father may have had. For all of us, the Earth was knocked off its axis on August 6, 1945. In that one moment, my father's war ended and my war, the Cold War, began. But in my terms, it seems so much messier than that. For we and that boy continued to live in the same world together for a long time, accepting and embroidering each other's silences. When I think of him now, when I realize that he, my father, and I still can't inhabit the same story except in silence, a strange kind of emotion rushes up in me, which is hard to explain. The bomb still runs like a fissure, but also like an attracting current, a secret unity through our lives. The rent it tore in history was deep, and the generational divide, given the experiences of those growing up on either side of it, profound. But any story would also have to hold the ways, even deeper and harder to fathom, in which we lived through it all together, in pain, hatred, love, and most of all, silence. So, now to Jeremy.
Very quickly there.
That's okay.
Just give us one moment to set up the mic here.
I can set it up. Yeah, I would like it to be on the other side.
You can do it. Okay. Here.
Excellent. Oh. Sorry.
Let's play with that.
X.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. As Tom was reading the second essay, at a part, because I've both read it and I've heard you read it before, I started drifting off into other war scenes that we've all experienced collectively over these years, not just under the Bush administration, but also now the reality that we're living in. And if you think about it, we remain a world on fire. You started off by talking about the fire of the nuclear bomb, but we truly are in a world on fire. The uprisings throughout the Arab world, the uprising in the United States, the Occupy movement here, the situation in Syria, which deteriorates by the moment, the reality from Libya that the United States still believes in regime change by force. You have an expanding air war in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia. You have night raids, you have an expansion of the use of special operations forces. And yet we remember the pledges that President Obama made when he was candidate Obama, how he was going to dismantle the Bush doctrine and he was going to re-engage the world. And indeed, the first several executive orders that he issued dealt with dismantling key parts of the torture apparatus in the United States. Pledges to close Guantanamo. The United States doesn't torture, bottom line. In fact, he gave that speech at the National Archive. And yet, if we fast forward to where we are now and we look at it, how big of a break have we seen from the Bush doctrine when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, I think up until recently, there was relatively little break. I mean, that is, I would put it this way. In the Bush administration, we already saw a break from the Bush doctrine. That is, you have the first Bush years, and then you have what I would call the Gates doctrine, which was kind of a management doctrine for the disaster of the Bush doctrine.
Referring to Defense Secretary Robert Gates.
Defense Secretary Robert Gates. And of course, when Obama came in, the first signal of what was going to happen was he kept Gates, and he took as his national security advisor someone who was a friend of John McCain's. So in a sense, we knew. I mean, the one thing I can proudly say is that within 2 weeks after Obama had taken over, I wrote a piece called "Don't Let Barack Obama Break Your Heart," because I could already see, at least in what we used to call foreign policy, where he was going. And what you had for those first few years was you really had a continuation of the latter period of the latter Bush years. You know, the ongoing two wars, a ratcheting up of counterterror, and so on and so forth. I think we have gotten to a point. Something is changing now. That's what I think. I think it's almost a tectonic moment. Partially because, first of all, it's a word nobody likes in this country generally, but let's say it: defeat. You know, we were defeated in Iraq. You know, the greatest army on earth. Was the greatest military. I mean, this was the Bush people were romantics about the American military. They thought it could do anything, and it turned out it could destroy a lot. It just couldn't build a damn thing. And in the end, it had to leave. It left Iraq, and we've seen just the other day, the embassy staff is now being slashed maybe by half. We can see that Iraq is fading and that the Iraq that's left, while a total mess, is also closer to Iran than it ever would have been under any other circumstances. So Iraq is kind of a goner in that sense. Afghanistan, you can feel their urge to get those troops out of Afghanistan. Not the special forces people and so on and so forth, but Afghanistan is going too. We had this week this lieutenant colonel, this truth teller, Daniel Davis, writing a piece, and it got a lot of attention. He wrote a piece saying everything that the military people was saying in Iraq, in Afghanistan, was a lie, you know. And he said, I've been on the ground for a year, and I have seen nothing of success, not a bit of it. Okay, so that was interesting. That got a lot of attention. What didn't get attention, and I thought was truly interesting, was that his piece, which was like a whistleblower piece, appeared in Armed Forces Journal. And that tells me that there are a lot of people in the military who know that Afghanistan is an utter disaster too. So you've got two war disasters. The answer is we're now heading into a new period, and it's really your period, Jeremy, where we're heading what I call offshore. Literally offshore, I mean, in the sense that it's going to be the Navy offshore in terms of the Air Force and drones, skies, but also, as I wrote recently, we're heading offshore of national sovereignty. We're trying to create a new kind of American way of war, I would say. I mean, it's been coming for a long while, and you've been reporting on it, but a new kind of American way of war in which, from wherever we are, we can bust into any other country, and only one country on earth has sovereignty. That's us, of course.
Mm-hmm. Right, you know, one of I think the key moments in the history of the Obama administration's foreign policy that has gotten almost no media attention is when David Petraeus was the commander of CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, which in the area of operations for Central Command extends to the entire Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, and for a period, now it's under AFRICOM, but for a period it also included East Africa. So it was Somalia, and the U.S. had a base in Djibouti that they took over from the French and reformed it into a CIA and Special Operations Forces base that was used to strike inside of Somalia. But when Petraeus was the CENTCOM commander, he authorized something called the AQN Exord, the Al Qaeda Network Execute Order, in September of 2009, and it was a limited view, paper-only order that authorized commanders in the field to have far greater latitude, U.S. military commanders in the field, to conduct lethal operations outside of the stated battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. And what it represented was an Obama administration co-signing of an earlier order that was issued under Bush at the end of 03-04. But that piece of paper was a key moment in September 2009 when the Obama administration said, we believe in the supreme right of the United States to militarily attack in any country, anywhere in the world where we determine there to be a terrorist threat. And it's the part of the military justification, and it's the justification given to Congress also when the military strikes in Yemen. Because remember, there were cruise missile attacks in Yemen in December of 2009, just right after that order was issued, that killed tremendous numbers of civilians. They missed their so-called target. Those were military operations. They were not briefed to the Intelligence Committee. It's a circumvention of any effective oversight. And you move toward where we are now. President Obama signed a lethal authorization, a lethal finding, to conduct a targeted assassination of a United States citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki, in Yemen. He also killed another U.S. citizen in authorizing that bombing, Samir Khan, who was the editor of Inspire magazine, the English language publication put out by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And then 2 weeks later, a U.S. drone strike kills Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, the 16-year-old son of Anwar al-Awlaki, who also was a U.S. citizen, who had not talked to his father in 3 years. And so I raise that because I spent a lot of time battling on Twitter when I'm on deadline for real stories. And so that's my test pool. Yeah. And I'll engage with somebody who has 3 followers and fight them for an entire afternoon, and I have 40-something thousand. But so just that's how deep into the trenches I'll get in the mud. But the point is, what's incredible to me is the number of seemingly well-intentioned liberals who are so willing to defend
the White House's right to assassinate a U.S. citizen who has not been indicted in a U.S. court and is not shooting at U.S. soldiers. And I think if McCain had been president, people would have been up in arms about this. Glenn Greenwald would not be a pariah among sort of Obama bots. He would be a guy who people were saying, oh, let's listen to Glenn Greenwald because he's a constitutional law expert. Now it's Glenn Greenwald. If people don't know, he's a Salon.com columnist and a wonderful mind. He would be viewed as the serious person that he is, and as he was taken by those same people under Bush. And now he's become a symbol of, well, those people are irreconcilables and they must want Mitt Romney to be president or Newt Gingrich to be president. He's normalized these policies for a huge number of liberals in this country, including killing our own citizens with no trial.
Well, there was a recent Washington Post, I'm sure you saw it, ABC poll, which showed that among some figures that were a lot better, it showed that 83% of Americans, including like a significant 50-odd% of liberal Democrats, were in favor of drone strikes wherever. It was actually a higher figure than that. It was 83% for killing Alaki. It was maybe in the 50s, but 65% actually. So those were striking figures. Along with that went 78% of Americans who, if not for withdrawal from Afghanistan, they were definitely for major drawdowns. So this I think to a lot of Americans looks like the easier, cleaner, less casualty-filled, less expensive path. And I think in a way it looks that way to the Obama administration too. Conceptually, what it's done and what it's doing is to turn the globe into, in Vietnam, there were certain areas of Vietnam during the Vietnam War that were called free fire zones, where you could just, in essence, you could fire at anything if you were an American soldier, up in an American plane, whatever. The Obama administration is now, this is the new thing that's happening. It's been happening for a while, but they are turning the globe into a free fire zone for us. And just to pick up on Petraeus, because he's an interesting figure to follow beyond 2009. In fact, I think he's fascinating today. David Petraeus, he was portrayed in Washington, both sides of the aisle, as America's savior in Iraq and then Afghanistan. He got out of both countries just in time, as far as I can see. But he was dealt with, he got more publicity than any American general since, MacArthur maybe, or Ike. He then was made, partially probably a political decision on Obama's part, but in terms of American politics, but he was made the CIA director. And so you have not a civilian, but a military man being made the CIA director, and he went himself into the shadows. So you look now, there are no profiles of Petraeus. He's hardly written about. He goes up and testifies every now and then, but it is remarkable how he's dropped out of the news. But at the same time, what you now have increasingly behind the scenes, in what in the 60s they used to call in the shadows, we see American war going into the shadows, and Petraeus is part of that. He's a man who relied in Iraq and Afghanistan on special operations forces, hunter-killer teams, night raids, and drones. He's now running the CIA, which specializes in, drones, hunter-killer teams, and so on and so forth, and he's clearly coordinating with the military. So you have those worlds melding, and to add to that, one thing, and this is an area you are deeply into, I know, when we talk about, like with Osama bin Laden's killing, when we talk about the elite SEAL 6 team, we think of it as some little group, but the special operations forces are now part-time and full-time 60,000. It's a secret army, like the CIA, developing within the military itself and going into the shadows. This is a very ominous development.
Well, yeah, and you have different tiers, as they call them, of operators within the special operations community. You have what are the vanilla special operations guys, the SEAL teams other than SEAL Team 6, and then you have people that essentially effectively operate as a private army under the direct orders of the president. He's the commander-in-chief, but he when the Somali pirates, for instance, were taken down in April of 2009, and 3 bullets, 3 guys down, that was Obama on the phone with the SEAL Team 6 commanders there, authorizing that kill in progress. But what's happened is that you've taken a world of people that in the dirt of the 1980s, when the U.S. was engaged in all of these wars in Central America, the Contra Wars, the Dirty War in Guatemala and elsewhere, these were the guys that existed in the shadows, and no one from the rest of the military really wanted much to do with them, and they weren't going to elevate within the U.S. military chain of command. When General Stanley McChrystal, who was the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command from 2003 to 2008, was appointed the commander of U.S. operations in Afghanistan, President Obama took someone who was generally regarded as a shadow figure, like you're talking about, and put him in charge of an entire war. And you saw a dramatic expansion in the number of night raids and the number of targeted kill operations that were going on the ground in Afghanistan. They've made them the premier part of the U.S. war machine rather than the sort of teams of last resort or the guys we dare not speak of. They are now at the vanguard of the whole thing. And let's remember, at the beginning of the Bush administration, Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney came in, and Rumsfeld and Cheney in particular viewed the CIA as a liberal institution that needed to be put in a corner. And so they dismantled the cooperation between the CIA and the Special Operations Forces. And they created a beast out of JSOC in doing that, out of the Joint Special Operations Command. Petraeus has brought the whole thing full circle at the CIA. And so Obama now has full spectrum dominance going on with those forces that Bush and Cheney spent several years trying to divide. And that's the reality that we're in right now. I wanted to also point something out, Tom, and ask you about this, and it might be a little outside of your lane, but I know you guys have covered it on Tom Dispatch. The discussion right now about Israel possibly attacking Iran, and the fact that we're seeing all of these Iranian scientists being assassinated with very sophisticated explosive devices. Motorcycles pull up, they put them under the car, that scientist is then killed. And it's a story that hasn't gotten as much attention as it should, but it's happening at a time when there's a lot of discussion about whether or not Israel will attack Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece recently in which I just simply took what we have done or Israel has done in Iran and reversed it. And simply said, well, just imagine for a minute, imagine the aircraft carrier. I mean, of course, the Iranians don't have an aircraft carrier. It's impossible to really do these reversals because we are still on a one-way planet. But imagine the aircraft carrier, the Khomeini, off the Florida coast, and the drones flying over the United States, and some kinds of kill teams in the capital, or in Los Alamos, slaughtering, assassinating U.S. scientists, and viruses being sent into our nuclear system by worms being sent into our nuclear computer system, and so on and so on. If you start to imagine this, of course, for us, there was one recent story in which it was claimed that a Texas car salesman had gone to the Mexican cartels and with money from an official Iranian group had worked toward the assassination, towards some assassinations in Washington. This may or may not be an accurate or real story, but
if it is accurate, we don't have that much to fear. If Iran's best agents are used car salesmen who cross the border from Mexico, I think we're okay.
But this, when this hit here, we sent the Saudis to the UN. There was a resolution. We went crazy. I mean, it was headlines. We said it was beyond all human bounds. But this stuff in Iran, nobody says anything. Of course, yes. I mean, the program against Iran is startling. On the other hand, I have never felt. I mean, the left has been talking about an attack on Iran since 2003. I ran one of those pieces at Tom Dispatch in, I think, 2003 or 2004. Even Dick Cheney couldn't pull the trigger. The Obama administration doesn't want to pull the trigger on Iran. The U.S. military doesn't. And I think that for everything that the Israelis say, that for them to go into a war without a green light from the United States, it could make them the least popular country on earth here. And it would be a very dangerous thing for them to do. So I think there are restraints on, I mean, this is a very dangerous situation, and the real danger, I think, is not that somebody's going to immediately decide to go into a war, but that there will be a miscalculation on one side or another. The people in Iran, Iran is very factionalized. It's a weak regional power, but the people in Iran, running Iran right now, are the hardline part of that fundamentalist regime, partially thanks to policies that we've carried out over the years. I mean, if you go back, I mean, if you were in Washington today and you were a reasonable person and thinking about this, you wouldn't touch Iran. Everything we've done has blown back. 1953, we overthrew the government, installed the Shah. That led to Khomeini. Late 1960s, we sold the first nuclear reactor to Iran to create the problem we're now dealing with. We backed Saddam Hussein in his invasion of, et cetera. You can run through all of this. Every single thing the United States did was a catastrophe. I mean, it's crazy that we're doing this, and the blowback from this, I mean, you're a blowback guy, the blowback from this here on the US economy, if something goes wrong, the blowback on the US economy, on all of us, on the gas price, I mean, it's going to be staggering. This is like unbelievably stupid. I find it amazing.
You know, something I want to add that I see in the, as I mentioned earlier, I was just in Yemen, and one of the things that sort of stunned me when I was in Yemen was the degree to which people spoke positively about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but simultaneously dismissed them as anything that the United States, like sort of perplexed as to why the United States would take the threat so seriously, and you know, numerous important tribal leaders said to me, don't you realize that when you guys bomb here and you hit a village full of people, that you're pushing people to support their agenda? It's not, and I'm going to have a piece in The Nation about this on my trip. It's not that people want to bring down American aircraft over Detroit, or that they want to send parcel bombs to Jewish community centers in Chicago. It's that the United States has supported a dictatorship in Yemen of Ali Abdullah Saleh. They gave him weapons, they gave him military aid, they built up units that were supposed to be for counterterrorism that were then turned against the Yemeni people and used against them when they rose up and even when they weren't rising up. And the government there ceased to provide services. And you have people that are in some way or another affiliated with Al-Qaeda that for years have been saying the United States is going to treat Yemen as their next Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Anwar al-Awlaki said the same thing. That the United States wants to turn Yemen into its next Afghanistan. And what do? Well, we start bombing Yemen. Yeah. And in the eyes of a lot of people, they're saying, you've backed a dictator. We don't even have trash collection in our community. There's no such thing as a court of law in much of Yemen. Poverty is biting. And the regime's family members are all bankrolled by the United States. So I'm going to go with the people that say Sharia law is the only way to bring law and order to our community. And what I saw there and in Somalia was people flocking to Al-Qaeda, but people's own indigenous belief system starting to merge closer and closer to that of the Al-Qaeda political message. And so the United States is creating the very reality that didn't exist, yeah, but it claimed to be fighting, and they're making it real.
And you have to extend that to the world. I mean, that is, it was the one thing I was going to say off, you know, I mean, when you start to talk about what we're doing militarily, it can sound awesome. I think the new version of our military first policy, the offshore version, is going to turn out to be another disaster. And I think it's worth just remembering to do for a little potted history, to go back to the demonstrations you talked about at the beginning, for a little potted history of our world. In the 1990s, we sent out, you could call them our economic jihadis, you know, to kind of flatten the world. I mean, they helped to create the 1% of the 90, I mean, there were many disparities in the world, but they helped to increase those disparities, 1%, 99%. In the next decade, the Bush decade, you could call it, we sent out our military first people who blew a hole directly through the middle of the Middle East, the greater Middle East. You know, these two sets of acts created the stage for, I mean, they created, it wasn't that what they globalized was protest. They created a planet on which everybody had, in a way, whether it was Yemen or Egypt or Chile or wherever, everybody had a 1% and a 99%, and a worse one than they had had 20 years before. You know, so that we are now on a planet in which it's true. If you're in Tahrir Square and you're in Moscow and you're in Occupy Washington or wherever, you have different seeming issues, but you've happened for the same reason. And the Obama doctrine, whatever it turns out to be, will only increase this, I think. You know, it will do what you're talking about in Yemen, it will do in Pakistan, it will do in wherever it turns. This is what it's going to do. And partially because, you know, Tom Dispatch, I'm proud to say, is the only place, I think, on this planet that has counted up the number of wedding parties. I mean, here we are, we talk about fear, this country is obsessed with the fear of terrorism. There was a study in the Times yesterday, 14,000 murders in the United States last year. Number of murders from Islamic extremists, 0. But Tom Dispatch has counted up through about 2009 the number of wedding parties blown away by the U.S. Air Force, 7 of them. It's absolutely startling. I mean, when you're blowing away wedding parties.
Well, and those are just the ones that we know.
Those are just the ones we know about.
Anand Gopal is here. He's one of the great reporters who really has done much to expose what's happened in Afghanistan, and I'm sure, because I've talked about it with him, that he would attest to this too. I mean, we probably know a tiny fraction of the killing that has happened, and that's just talking about the U.S. killing that's happened, or civilian deaths that have been caused by night raids based on bad intelligence. So you may have been able to compile the ones that we know about.
These are just the ones that were reported.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and we know it's more. We probably should open this up to questions for a
little
while.
I just wanted to say one other thing briefly. I remember I spent a lot of time in Iraq starting in I guess it was late 1997. I first went to Iraq and was there consistently from then through the beginning of the so-called shock and awe. And I remember that the day that Saddam's statue was pulled down by Ahmed Chalabi's people and the United States military, but then it was sort of portrayed as it was Iraqis going and taking down the statue of Saddam in Firdos Square. I remember I got all these emails from people saying, you know, look, you were wrong about everything, and look at how the Iraqis are celebrating, and they, you know, it's exactly what, you know, what Wolfowitz and others said was going to happen, and sort of sticking it in my face. And, you know, I would invite them to take a look at Iraq today, and you know, the horrifying reality that exists for so many Iraqis. People are practically begging for Saddam to be back, which says a lot, because Saddam, I was told stories by people whose children said that their dad was smarter than Saddam Hussein, and someone comes to the home and then cuts the father's tongue out. I mean, this was real stuff under Saddam. When I was there when Abu Ghraib prison was emptied in October of 2002, and Saddam let 30,000 prisoners out, and some people came out chanting "Down, down, Qasem," because who ruled Iraq before Saddam and the Ba'ath Party took over a half a century earlier. They had been in prison for so long they didn't know who was the president of Iraq. So there's no doubt about it. It was brutal. Yeah. So for people to say it was better under Saddam is really saying something. Yeah. But I raise that because the U.S. Libya bombing, and of course it's an extreme. We could spend 4 hours analyzing what happened in Libya. There is the convergence of popular uprisings, and then the might of empire military, which is NATO coming in. And I think that however you view the internal dynamics in Libya, what overthrew Muammar Gaddafi was the bombing campaign far more than any domestic insurrection within Libya. The two converged, but without that air power, Gaddafi probably would not have fallen as swiftly as he did. Syria, there's a lot of people pushing for the United States or for NATO to go in and bomb. Syrian friends of mine that 2 years ago were pro-Assad are saying, no, we want the United States to come in and bomb, and they point to videos that they see from homes and elsewhere. But who's asking the question, what comes after? What's been dismantled is an Arab nationalism that really kept in check some of the forces that we're seeing rise up. Some of the Islamist forces, the Salafist movements in other countries. People have been so thoroughly punished by some of these US-backed dictatorships, they turn deeper and deeper toward religion. And I don't get a sense, I'd be curious on what you think, Tom, that US policymakers are thinking much further than the news cycle and what public pressure seems to be brought on large media outlets or by influential permanent think tankers.
I mean, so much of what we think of as policy overseas is actually driven by what's going on here. I mean, just to give you an odd example, but to go back to Iran, I mean, we have an odd political situation here where normally a Democrat would rule on the issue of jobs, and the Republicans would rule on the issue of national security. Now, this is kind of reversed at this point. Obama rules on national security. I mean, the polls show that people back his national security policy. He killed Osama bin Laden, et cetera, et cetera. So the Republicans are forced into the strange and almost mad position of demanding, the one thing they can demand is that he attack Iran tomorrow, in essence. My answer, by the way, on war on Iran is if you know, one of the Republicans get in, we really are probably in trouble on that. So the Republicans.
You know, Rick Santorum said that the Crusades got a bad rap.
Yeah,
recently.
I did see that. But in the same way.
That's totally true, by the way.
In the same way, Obama is by what the Republicans are doing on Iran, Obama is forced to take a stronger and stronger policy on Iran. He himself is being pushed on Iran to take an ever stronger policy, and this is domestic policy, domestic politics playing into what's. And I think that these guys, on the whole, first of all, the thing I would say about the Obama administration generally is the Bush people were visionaries. They were mad visionaries, but they had a vision of the globe, of how it worked and how it should work. They were completely wrong. They were crazed visionaries. The Obama people are kind of managers, and I think they're managing, just as you say, by the moment, by the week, you know, not by the year. I don't think they have any vision of what's happening. They're almost just trying to keep up with events, I think.
Now that Tom and I have thoroughly uplifted everyone in the room,
right.
We'll open it up, and if we could try to have some gender equity in the questioning, that would be great. So do you want to? Sure. We have this gentleman here. Yeah, she's bringing it to you.
I'd like to ask you if you've heard about it and believe that sufficient attention has been paid in terms of the press to the following. In September of last year, Christopher Edley, the dean of the California Law School, who was also on the Obama transition team, I understand he was number 6. He was at a conference where they were discussing law and order. And what came up, of course, John Yoo is in the has tenure again in the same university. And what came up was a question about, shall the Obama administration prosecute those people who've committed crimes in the previous administration? And he said he voted, along with, it sounded like 6 or 7 other people, to recommend that they don't prosecute the offenders in the previous administration. And he said I guess it was unanimous, and he gave his reason, and this is the important thing I would think, he gave us his reason that if they did, he felt that the CIA and the military would manage a coup. Later, I understand when he was questioned further on it, he responded with an email and so forth, and because the person who was asking me mentioned something about justice, and he says sometimes justice has to give way to politics. That was his statement. Later he tried to defend that. Have you heard about it? And because as far as I know, it hasn't made much mass media appear.
I haven't heard about that, but first of all, I would say that I find it a little hard to believe. I actually don't think a coup. The military would have no reason in the United States to launch a coup. They've got more or less what they want. I mean, but I would say that the Obama made a decision almost from the second he came in. I mean, he said very early on, we're going to look forward, not backward. And he has, and I think actually the striking thing about this moment, and I don't think it's just a matter of the CIA and the military, is that that the whole what I would call the national security complex has simply passed out of our legal system totally. That is, we are still in our legal system, but if you're in the national security complex, whatever you do, You will never be accountable for it, and no one has been accountable for anything. I don't think it matters whether it's torture or anything else. There's only one crime, as far as I can see, in post-legal America in terms of the our national security state, and that crime is whistleblowing. And the Obama administration has time and time again, and Glenn Greenwald's been great on this, and Tom Dispatch has covered as well, gone after anybody who would tell Americans what's going on inside the government. That's what I would say.
And I think another important part of this is the United States, if you go and you look at various speeches by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, has been consistently calling for or supporting processes of accountability in other countries, in Kenya and elsewhere around the world, and saying there has to be an accounting for these. And the logic of it is brilliant in that they're saying the only way to prevent this from happening again is to expose what happened and then hold those responsible accountable. But that's for the rest of the world. Yeah. For us, it's we need to move forward, and I mean I'm going to try that if I get pulled over for speeding. Let's look forward, officer, not backwards. But I think the most serious ramification of that policy, which I really question seriously the wisdom of it, is that there's no incentive to think twice about doing those things if you're in the field and you feel you can justify it. And I think there are a lot of intelligence professionals in the United States that were absolutely repulsed by what their colleagues did. And I know of people within the CIA who quietly resigned, and there was never a story done about them. Those people, I do believe, represent the vast majority of people that work in the U.S. intelligence apparatus. I do not believe that they support torture. And I think there would be a lot of support for some process of accountability. They might not want the accountability many people in this room may see as sufficient, but I agree with Tom that there's no need for any kind of a coup d'état. President Obama has been so generous to the special operations community, not just on the level of supporting them militarily, but also in supporting the agenda of some of the more aggressive commanders. Admiral William McRaven, who's been promoted to the head of Special Operations Command. Well, McChrystal got taken down in a different way, but he and Obama were very close on a military level. Petraeus ascending to the ranks of CIA. The military-industrial complex and those within the military that are the real power brokers are faring quite well under President Obama, accountability or not. So, yeah.
Hi. Thank you for speaking, by the way. I really appreciate. I especially appreciate. Is it on?
Yeah.
I especially appreciate discussion about the Japanese, and what it actually reminded me of was Korematsu v. United States, which is still the prevailing law. The law is that you can discriminate by race only if it's for the purposes of preserving national security. And I was wondering, with the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, what that holds for the future, not only of American minorities, but also of people abroad.
But also of?
Just people abroad, because I know that we were talking about how there's a mirror, right?
Yeah.
So.
Do you want? No, go ahead.
I think I would almost just repeat what I've already said, which is simply that, I mean, the thing that's striking in our moment is that whatever the government decides it's going to do, and we've seen this now over a decade, it then calls together a group of lawyers, and the lawyers create a legal explanation for it, a legal justification for it, often at length. I mean, like we know, although we haven't seen it, that the Olaki assassination, that there's a 50-page legal justification by the Justice Department's lawyers. It hasn't been released, but we know it's there. I don't think it's been released anyway.
No.
And once they've created this justification, it's called legality, and then they do it. So, I mean, at this point, the national security state, I mean, think of it as like a mothership that's lifted off the American earth, and it is creating its own reality, and it's creating it on one basis, and that basis is terrorism. I mean, this is why I called my book The United States of Fear, because it is the infusion of fear into the society that's created the national security state as we know it. That state is incredible. The Cold War state was huge. There was, at least in the Cold War, a country we called an enemy, and it had a huge nuclear arsenal. It had an enormous military. Now we have around the world a couple of minority insurgencies, a few thousand jihadi people who want to do something to the United States, maybe. We have a couple of weak regional powers who we declare enemies. I mean, it's really a paltry thing. And the national security state, based on fear, is so much bigger than anything in the Cold War period. It's absolutely staggering. And I think the one thing you could say, okay, you wanted to go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, just adding directly trying to address part of what you said there. When I flew into JFK from Yemen a couple weeks ago, I had a nice little chat with the guy at customs. He then swipes my I said I was in Yemen. He said, "What are you doing?" I told him, I'm a journalist, blah, blah, blah. He's like, "Oh, well, welcome home. Glad you're safe." Swipes my passport and goes, "Whoa." And, I ended up in this place in JFK called Area 3 and had a counterterrorism interview where, they were asking me do I have military experience, do I have explosives training, do I have weapons training, and we had this sort of back and forth, and they asked me about some previous trips that popped up on their machine, and this has happened to me a number of times where I'll get, when you go to Somalia, you probably can expect that they're going to pull you in for some questioning, but the reason I bring it up is because in those rooms, every time I've been taken, I am always the only white person, always, and I'm always the first one to leave. And I've seen people get taken into another room. I've seen people sitting there and sitting there and sitting there. And it's every time I leave, I feel like I've participated in something horrifying. Because in this particular case, and I was on Egypt Air, I was sitting in Cairo before I flew back to the United States, from this couple that had two little kids, and I was watching them play, and I was zoning out because I had just been in this Al-Qaeda-controlled area in Yemen, and I was enjoying zoning out and watching these two kids play with their parents. And that family was in that room when they came there, and they were there before I got there, and they were there when I was leaving. If you look at it, I mean, we are a nation that is racially and religiously and ethnically profiling people, regardless of who's in power. The hearings that Representative Peter King has held about radicalization, it's all meant to terrorize the American people. It's meant to make us afraid. And the statistics that Tom cited, I think, are very important for all Americans to hear about who is killing people inside of this country on a regular basis, what kinds of incidents actually threaten our national security, and the sacred cow that no one wants to touch in this arena is what kind of foreign policy would actually make us safer? Because you know what? A war of attrition isn't going to do it. Yeah. There's not a finite number of bad guys that you kill and it's over. Yeah. Our policy is creating terrorism. And I think that is the hardest debate that people in this country have to have is first to own that and then say, what do we do about it now?
The Bush administration discovered very quickly that fear of a very specific sort was a kind of a gold mine. I mean, I have to say, normally when you get ruling groups, the striking thing about ruling groups is before they manipulate anybody else, they tend to manipulate themselves. So that I mean, if you look back at early Cold War documents from the National Security Council, people writing to 30, 40, 50 other people, where nobody else was going to see it, the language is the kind of anti-communist language you would expect them to be using to manipulate people out there. But first they're convincing each other. So I'm sure the Bush people were in their own way scared. But they found very quickly that fear, it wasn't just fear. It was fear of a very specific sort, and that was purely fear of terrorism. Now, it is a weird thing. Since 9/11, I've taken a look at this, and I think you can count somewhere between 25 and 30 deaths in the United States due to anything you might vaguely call terrorism, and that includes the Gabriel Giffords killings, and the guy.
She wasn't killed, but other people.
No, the other people who were killed there, and the guy, the angry guy who plunged his plane into an IRS building in, I think, Austin, and killed himself and an IRS guy. I mean, this is worse than shark attacks, and not worse than any other danger Americans face. But this is what I mean, you name it. 33,000 people dead on the roads, 14,000 murders, dust devils kill more. I mean, it's unbelievable. And of course, then there are the real dangers of our world. Lost job. I mean, if you were to simply count up the number of people, I know this without doing it, the number of people who have killed somebody because they lost a job or lost their home or killed themselves in the process, you would be in staggering figures by comparison. But this little thing, the government has given us a 100% guarantee on only one thing. Things that we really need it on, we don't get it. But on this, you know, we are supposed to, and that's why airports and everywhere else, we've gone crazy, and they've built a structure filled with money, you know, that guarantees a small number of people lifetime jobs and everything else. They're never going to go under. I think it's a terrible, striking thing of our moment.
I will say I was quite pleased though in Yemen. Every time I got on a plane there, I was always the person searched the most thoroughly of anyone. I fit whatever profile it is that they're looking for, which is probably CIA agent.
Do we have any other questions here?
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, it's Bill Hartung, is it? Yeah. From.
Oh my God! Hi,
I'm
Bill.
a think tank
Great.
liberal.
He's
You
a
have
think tank liberal.
You have to speak up, Bill, for me.
Jeremy, you talked about sort of jokingly how uplifting the conversation is, which in a way I think it is. Speaking truth to power is uplifting. But, you know, Tom, you've talked about American culture, the addiction to violence. How do we get traction in a country where even liberals are saying targeted assassination makes sense, drone wars make sense, essentially as long as we don't get hurt, meaning Americans? Information doesn't seem to be enough. So where do we get our footing? Where do we get our traction, not only to inform people, but to inspire them to push for progressive foreign policy? And I'm asking you this partly because people always ask me this, and therefore I want your answer so I can use it.
Which I don't have.
I think that you know, part of the problem of the last several years is that I think we were at a moment where most Americans, regardless of their political views, were sick of these wars. Yeah. Regardless of whether they supported them initially or their views on how you fight terrorism and all those things, I think people were getting sick of wars. And I do think that the economic crisis in the country created a moment where those people that had been agitating against these wars could also make an economic argument that wouldn't necessarily have been their predominant argument that they would have made in opposing the wars, but it would have resonance with a lot more people as people were losing their jobs, and then endless money was still being spent on these wars. I do think that the fact that you have a very popular president among liberals, President Obama, who has a social agenda that, while some on the left side of the Democratic Party and certainly people to the left of the Democratic Party are very disillusioned with, he remains extremely popular among the huge base of middle-of-the-road or mainstream Democrats. And the fact that he is also perceived to be infinitely smarter than Bush, and I think it's a correct perception, has really pulled the rug out from under people arguing against these wars, because in terms of the debate in the public sphere, and I think it's why you see the poll numbers like we saw, support for drone strikes, support for the killing of al-Awlaki, because I think people tend to think he's smart, he's a constitutional law expert, he must know what he's doing. And I will say, the Obama administration, they're very sophisticated in trying to figure out legalistic ways to continue some of Bush's policies and to make them lawful. That's a very damaging aspect of this presidency for those in the anti-war camp who want the U.S. out of all these places and to stop with the targeted assassinations. I do think if a Republican had been president, it would have been a very different discussion. Having said that, I think we have to persevere. In a way, I remember, I'm old enough now and have gray in my beard, so I lived during the Clinton era as an adult. And I mean, I wouldn't necessarily act like an adult, but I was an adult. And I remember it was a dark, dark period when you were trying to mobilize against, U.S. bombings, the bombing of Sudan, the bombing of Afghanistan, the 78-day bombing of Yugoslavia over Kosovo with no UN authorization. It was a big NATO adventure. There are periods like that when the tentacles of empire are extended by Democrats and normalized for a lot of the population. I think we're in one of those periods right now. I think it's a real uphill battle.
And I think it's in large part because Obama has effectively convinced a large portion of his base that this is the right way to go. And he can say, well, I'm drawing down in Iraq and Afghanistan. So people have the perception it's sort of coming to an end. But in reality, it's a shift in tactics. So
I wanted to say something, to be as hopeful as I could be. That's Bill Hartung, who, by the way, has done a wonderful book about Lockheed Martin, and has been toiling in the fields of turning out good information for a long time. And I want to say, I think we have to take a longer view. And as I sat here and listened to you, I was remembering a month back or whenever it was, I was standing at the edge of Zuccotti Park when a whole bunch of union people, it was a march, and they simply appeared, and I was surrounded by these guys, and there was a big guy next to me, I forget which union he was from, and he was looking down on what looked a little like a hippie encampment, and I'm from the 60s, and my experience of the 60s was this should have been a moment of hostility, and he started off, he said, this 99%, we were talking about the 1% of the 99% for years, and I thought I was going to think, oh my God, he's going to attack them. They've gotten the credit. He said it's so great, they've put this on the map, And I thought this is wonderful, but I thought to myself as well, it was true that parts of the labor movement had been talking about the 99%. It just hadn't gotten traction yet. Drones, it hasn't gotten traction yet, and I kind of know why. I mean, being against a drone, given how they've been presented generally in the United States, it's like being against an iPhone or something, I mean, a sexy, perfect weapon, I mean, they're not. They will be disasters. I mean, or put it another way, like all perfect weapons, from the tank on, they never deliver what the fabulous things they're supposed to deliver, but they embed themselves into our world and become, in the case of drones, will become almost everything in our world, I'm afraid. But I think there is hope. I think if we just keep at it, we're not on that old planet anymore. We now are on a planet of protest, here and elsewhere. And we don't know where that's going to go, and we don't know when people are going to make the connection between domestic issues and the foreign issues. It hasn't fully been made yet, but it will be, I think. It's just my thought.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I was interested in the criticism that you both seem to have of the media and of journalists, and you kind of alluded to this news cycle mentality where the cycle is just kind of feeding on itself rather than, at minimum, reflecting reality or kind of attempting a sustained analysis of what's going on, to the degree to which policy is becoming more reactionary to a news cycle rather than maybe a different time where the news cycle would actually respond to the policy. So I wanted to know what you thought the origins of kind of this media monster might be, and then what your advice is for journalists now to do the kind of work that needs to be done.
That's a good question.
I think that it long predates my birth, the role that the media, that powerful media outlets have played in fueling conflict and war, and it also has to do with media ownership, and at a different time in history. In fact, Juan Gonzalez, who's a great columnist for the New York Daily News and is a couple days a week the co-host on Democracy Now!, wrote a brilliant book that is really it's a history of media owned by a small group of corporations going back a couple hundred years in the United States to the first creations of newspapers within the United States. And in telling the story, he describes how a relatively small group of people have always sort of been in control of news dissemination, and that they're part of the same circles of people that are in charge of deciding U.S. policy. But it's also documented in a very fascinating way, and the way that he tells the story is great. So I would recommend people to look for Juan Gonzalez's book on this. I think, though, that the cable news, the creation of 24-hour cable news we crossed some sort of a line there into a different reality, when you could turn on the TV and at any moment see some pundit or talking head pushing their agenda, and the think tanks are on there endlessly. No offense, Bill. the army of former generals embedded in the newsrooms of CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, who also were getting briefings from the Pentagon on what they should be saying when they go on these TV networks. I mean, there is a sort of attempt to manufacture consent that is a concerted effort. But I also think that we've had a real sensationalization of news, and you know, if it bleeds, it leads, and you have the sort of rise of aggregator sites that are more curated. You know, when Daily Beast started, although they've started to do more of their own reporting, Huffington Post, you know, has really good reporters on Capitol Hill and the White House. You know, Sam Stein and Ryan Grimm are both really great reporters, and Ryan Grimm is a friend of mine, and he does great reporting. But it's also, you know, it's an operation of sex sells, pop culture sells, and that's flashing at you on the screen. And I think that in a way, we have a media culture now that wants to see those celebrity moments represented in every aspect. The obsession with celebrity culture and, you know, lulz cats and all that stuff is now our coverage of Libya and Syria, and it has to be sexy, it has to be graphic, it has to be now, something has to be done about it. And I think that it's part of our short attention span society. If you look at the Obama administration's very slow response to the uprising in Egypt and sort of the flirtation with keeping Mubarak on, I don't think, had it not been for Al Jazeera, I don't believe that the Obama administration would have taken the position it finally did on Mubarak when it did. I think it would have taken a lot longer. And maybe that was a case where a media outlet did something that had an end result that was good. Wolf Blitzer has been really pushing for war against Syria. I mean, almost overtly. You see he almost wants to make love to the war on Syria. He's like so into it. And it's like, Wolf, man, take a Xanax or something. You know, and so I think I think it's cable news, and I think it's the sort of you know, tabloidization of news culture in this country, combined with an industry of think tankers and pundits, largely drawn from their former government positions and still advocating for whatever their friends within the structure want to see happen. I don't know if that's I threw a lot out there.
Yeah, I'll just say two little. I mean, just these are almost examples, but I'm still struck that when you, in all the period when you read about Iraq, I mean every couple of years there was an anniversary of something, the invasion, the whatever, you know, that was celebrated or whatever it was, and always the experts they asked were the experts who had made a mistake on Iraq or wanted to invade Iraq. I mean to this day I have just about never seen in the mainstream somebody who was out in the streets, and you could find journalists who were out in the streets, who went out to protest the invasion of Iraq. You know, you cannot, it's the people who, you know, I think it was George Ball back in the Kennedy-Johnson days who said about being inside an administration, he said, you can be a hawk and be wrong, and you're kept. The only thing you can't be is be a dove and be right. You know, and there's something about that in the media too, and particularly in the world of punditry, and it's very striking. The other thing,
it's who's chosen to be on these shows too. Yeah. I mean, if
it's the same
people
thing.
That are you don't have actual dissidents in the United States that are, and you know, we never call people that, but there are dissidents in the United States who are very, very sharp people, and they're almost never allowed on those shows. No, you have to have former something in front of you to be. Look at the Republican debate sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, where David Addington, you know, Cheney's former henchman, and Paul Wolfowitz are allowed to ask questions as though they have any business being out in public without someone coming up and confronting them for what they did about Iraq. And yet here they are, asking a question as though they're just ordinary Americans with concerns about foreign policy.
You know,
I mean, you don't deserve to be there, and yet that's who CNN has in their debate asking questions.
You know, the other thing I was struck by the other day, there's a journalism website that weekly offers a kind of a rundown of what they call, you know, at least a journalistic term, they call the news hole. You know, what was in the news hole this week? And I looked for January at the news hole, and it was really striking. The media news hole was 41% campaign 2012. That was the overall media news hole, which included, papers, TV, probably the internet, and so the online stuff, and so on and so forth. And when you say 41%, very little of that's Obama. It's almost all the ongoing Republican debate story. And cable news, it was 64%. That was the news hole. That's what was there, And to me, one of the most striking things about that is, whatever people write about it, they don't write the one thing that seems to me most obvious, which is the one thing that comes from this coverage. If you make this election the election of the century, the money that comes in to particularly cable news station owners, it's the ads, all those attack ads. If it's up there and it's big and 3 people are vying, you get $20 million in Florida or $40 million in Florida, and that all comes in mostly to TV stations. This is one of the great conflict of interests of our time, and if it happened in some other business, somebody would notice. But nobody says a word about it. It's just unwritten.
Well, let's be honest, the show Mad Men was not on during these Republican debates, so people needed something to watch, and it was, no.
Maybe we should call it quits, because people have been sitting for a long while.
You have, you're not allowed to leave, Tom.
Oh, I can't leave yet, okay.
You have 4 more minutes.
Okay.
So then I'm going to interrupt with the question. Thank you both for being here. I was wondering if you could address how perhaps one can actually view, a war in Iran has, in a sense, already started by the Obama administration. And I'm not talking about military strikes, but I'm talking about sanctions. Sanctions on Iran have been going on for a while now. But what the Obama administration did in December, right before New Year's Eve, those sanctions are extremely, I think, frightening and can be considered a war. Now we're reading reports about grain shipments being turned away from Iran because there's a freeze on financial transactions. From my understanding, the central bank sanctions aren't entirely complete, but from speaking to my father in Iran, I see that he's talking about businesses absolutely halting and these grain shipments being turned around. So to think about a little bit, if you could comment on sanctions, not only paving the path to war, as we saw happen in Iraq, right? You had Bush father, then you had the Clinton administration who imposed the hardest sanctions in modern history, and then continued by Bush after him, and then there was war. But how, again, so we see in Iran, I think, sanctioning of the central bank is arguably a war, an economic war on the Iranian people, but also to take seriously that it's not just, because people defend Obama saying, well, he's doing this to not do that, but how they also are preparation for war. And sorry, and I don't mean to, but so this is one thing, and secondarily, I was really pleased and not surprised, given who the two of you are, to see you, hear you speak with such opposition to what was done to Iraq, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and simultaneously talk about the egregiousness, that's even too light of a word, of the Saddam Hussein government. And I bring this up now because people are organizing against a war in Iran. Slowly, it's a trickle, but it's happening. But one thing that causes me great distress, I was just at an anti-Iran war sanctions protest on Saturday, is that a section of the left, maybe they're small, but they're significant, and I think really a scourge on an anti-war movement, are attacking, finishing, Jeremy, Iranians who are simultaneously people who are taking a position against war and sanctions, but also the repression of the Iranian government. So if you could speak to that.
Let me just say that this is not something that's only being said. I just want to point out, since we were talking about the Republican debates, that one striking bit of cognitive dissonance rather than dissidence, is that you have one guy in the Republican debates standing there saying things that should send a Republican to hell, and that's Ron Paul, who has been saying very directly that sanctions are an act of war, that these sanctions are an act of war. It is strange. You will not find this among Democrats right now, but you will find he's the one person I see who up there in any major way who is saying that. And obviously, they're not only potentially acts of war, but they're not going to strike against the Iranian leadership. They're going to strike against ordinary Iranians, which is, of course, what happened in Iraq as well in the Saddam Hussein years. And of course, there are all sorts of dangers in our world as well, because the thing that's only a bit talked about in our world is if something really blows with Iran and that oil flow ceases, you know, it's going to be worse than the Libyan situation, and the global economy is going to suffer. I mean, this is one of these mad situations in which you could end up with a great recession, a great depression. I mean, the blowback from this could be enormous, and so I think it's a dangerous situation. I think it's something that should be organized against. You know, I don't know what else you have to say.
The only thing I'll say in closing about that is, you know, there are different kinds of sanctions, and you know, there are sanctions that are aimed at cutting off a regime's weapons supply, which is particularly ironic when the United States is simultaneously profiting from a regime's oil and then saying they're sanctioning them on a different level. I mean, it gives you a pretty clear sense if you actually get into the mechanics of sanctions. The hypocrisy of the U.S. is all over the mechanics of sanctions. It was in Iraq as well. It encouraged an oil smuggling that the U.S. was the primary beneficiary of when the sanctions were imposed on Iraq. And the primary people that were punished by the Iraq sanctions were, of course, the Iraqi people, not the regime. And so, you know, sanctions can be a form of economic warfare, and not all sanctions are created equal. And I think that, you know, people are kind of giving the administration a pass by just saying, well, sanctions sound like an alternative to war. They're not always an alternative to war. They certainly weren't in the case of Iraq. In a way, I think more people died as a result of the sanctions on Iraq than died during the entire U.S. military campaign in Iraq, which is stunning if you think about it. And I saw it firsthand in the 1990s. So, and I think a lot of people are around the world right to be concerned with what's going to happen throughout the Arabian Peninsula, what's going to happen in the Middle East and North Africa, what's going to happen out of Afghanistan. We're in a world on fire right now, and some of those fires, it's good that they're burning. And I don't necessarily mean violent fires. I mean fires of resistance too in the United States and elsewhere. And some of them could really rage to a point where it grows beyond control.
And there's one other thing to say about sanctions, which is not clear.
In 30 seconds.
30 seconds, which is not clear here, which is here it looks as though sanctions is some kind of global policy that everybody agrees on. In fact, the United States agrees on it, Israel agrees on it, the Europeans have gone along with it because the Europeans for the last 50 years have done nothing but go along with U.S. policy. I mean, they can't not do that at some level. When they finally do, you'll know we're in a truly different world. But the rest of the world, Asia, China, Brazil, even Turkey, which is not particularly friendly with Iran at this point. I mean, you run through the whole southern world and the Asian world, and it is a world that is against this sanctions policy. So it's a complicated situation.
The book is called The United States of Fear. Tom Engelhardt is the author. Haymarket Books published it. Thank you to the Arthur Carter Center for Journalism. And thank you for everybody for coming tonight. And thank you. Pick up the book.